Hello, ladies and gents, metalheads across the globe, and welcome to episode 68. Hey, we're getting close to 69.
Mm-hmm.
And, well, it's just Ricky and I once again, but as you can tell from Ricky's reaction over here, we have reached his wheelhouse and breaking point. We are doing the top 10 Death Doom albums.
Oh, fuck me. Oh, God. Uh, just put me out of my misery already.
Oh,
I,
dear me.
I mean, this list was the hardest list I had to do, even harder with ACDC.
Hmm.
And that one was a game changer, but this one, ugh.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have
So
no
the
idea,
so
guys.
the backstory here is well how we all got into Death Doom. So for me, getting into Death Doom kind of came relatively easy because I was already into death metal like 7, 8 years ago, and as I was getting into more research about all the subgenres of what have you, and then I see this thing called Death Doom, and I'm like, this is intriguing. And basically, for those who don't know what Death Doom is, it's essentially death metal and doom metal mixed together. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, the mixture can vary. Some bands will go more into the doom direction, but good chunk of bands, like pretty much I would say like 70% of death doom bands go a little more in the death metal direction, which for me to be death doom proper, like because of course we're going to talk about some bands where they were definitely more on the doom side, but for me personally to be a death doom band, 60% death metal, 40% doom. Or essentially, you're just playing death metal at a slow, doomy pace. For me, at
Mm-hmm.
least. Because there are pretty much like two subsects of death doom. There's traditional death doom, which is essentially death metal meets Black Sabbath, where it's much more brutal, more heavy. Definitely good amount of melody, but not the focal point of the music. And then we get to Ricky's side of the spectrum, and that's the melodic death doom side, which is basically mixing melodic death metal and evolved doom in today's day
Mm-hmm.
and age. So, yeah, two different subsects, but they both have a lot in common. And then, of course, Death Doom is often seen as like one of the big pillar points for what became Funeral Doom, which we're not
Oh,
covering here
yeah.
because that's totally different from what we're talking about here. Of course, there
Yeah.
is some crossover, but for the
Mm-hmm.
most part, no Funeral Doom here. Straight up Death Doom. Enough said. But how I got into
Mm-hmm.
Death Doom was bands like Autopsy. Like as I was getting into death metal early on, and I listened to Autopsy, and they were so different from the death metal I was listening to, like Death and Cannibal Corpse and Morbid Angel and Deicide and those bands. They were much slower, much more raw, much more atmospheric, and same amount of brutality as a band like Cannibal Corpse, but in a different sense. Then from there, I went back and discovered the early roots of the genre, bands like Asphyx and Paradise Lost, Winter, and it just goes on and on and on. And even some bands that weren't Death Doom kind of went down that rabbit hole on an album or two, which I will mention a big one when we get into the list. But that's how I got into it. Ricky, and while you tell, I'm going to grab some props.
Yeah. So the thing with Defter with me was that, you know, since I like more of the somber kind of things in metal, Deftoon was kind of one of those subgenres that I could easily get into. And I remember my introduction to Deftoon was actually not Deftoon proper, was actually my Dying Bride, because I started listening to like Gods of the Sun, which was their more one of their early gothic albums. So that I remember for a long time that was like my favorite My Dying Bride album. And as the years went by, and then when Banger TV started doing their shows, when they did the Death Doom episode, it really got me intrigued because they started mentioning bands like Paradise Lost and Asthma. I mean, All of the Sun. I mean, my favorite Death Doom band of all time. And then, of course, they went more deep into the rabbit hole with bands like Aspects, Winter, so on and so forth, to the point that I began to dive more into Death Doom, and it has become, my favorite subgenre in metal because it's somberly, it's heavy, doomy, sometimes brutal at times. But everything about Death Doom that I love is that you can, like Levi said, you can go either the more more death Black Sabbath esque Death Doom, or you can go the more somber lane, melodic Death Doom, which I personally love the melodic Death Doom, but I can appreciate and love the brutality of like bands like Aspects and Winter and so on and so forth. But and Death Doom is one of the most diverse subgenres in metal because everywhere you go, I mean, yeah, there's a correlation between Death Doom and Funeral Doom, which there's some bands that go in between the camps, and then of course there's a correlation between Death Doom and Gothic metal, which we covered when the Gothic metal episode. It's Death Doom is one of those genres that the more you go into it, the more you find, and trust me, I've gone to this rabbit hole for the past almost close to 4 years, and holy shit, this was an amazing subgenre for me to find because, like I mentioned before, I love the brutality of everything Death Doom brings to the table, the melodic, the sadness, the sorrowness, the brutality, everything about Death Doom I love, and like I said, that's become my favorite, my wheelhouse basically, and the majority of my collection is Death Doom, like a big chunk of it.
Hmm.
And of course, also not to mention Blaine Smith doing his metal monthlies. He's a big Death Doom guy. He kind of showed me more bands that I
Same
recently
here.
enjoyed. So thanks for Blaine for actually giving me those suggestions. And yeah, we are today, and it's gonna be a pain in the ass to do. Trust me, it's like picking your favorite child in a way.
Two for you, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, part of the reason why we decided to do this episode
Mm-hmm.
was because fairly recently, like a few weeks ago, Banger TV over on their Twitch channel, where they've been doing their old Lock Horn show again, but in a
Mm-hmm.
kind of like a combination of their old format and recent format,
Mm-hmm.
where they go on Tier Maker, great website to do this kind of stuff, and they did their Death Doom list, and they had it separated into 5 categories: Proto, the Legend, Essential Early, Essential Modern, and then like the rest slash recommended.
Like
Now,
modern esque.
yeah.
Now, do we want to talk
Now,
about the legend, or are we gonna do
well,
this?
before we get into our actual list, so 2
Mm-hmm.
problems with Banger TV's episode. Their Legend choice, not that it's a bad album, it's worthy, but not like
Yeah.
the essential, like the absolute
Oh.
essential Death Doom. But their biggest mistake, not putting Asphyx in there. Well, they had him in at one point, and then of course this gets into a bit of an issue with Death Doom, like how much of it do you have to be considered? Because then there came the debate on Asphyx. Are they Death Doom or are they more death metal? For me, they're Death Doom that just happens to have
Mm-hmm.
moments of thrash in
Yeah.
there, which I don't think disqualifies you, because after all, you have to have some of that kind of
Yeah.
rhythmical adventure of death metal to
Yeah.
be Death Doom. So that takes
Yeah.
care of that.
It's
But
kind of
now,
like for example, like just say Swallow Sun. They incorporate black metal elements to their Death Doom. Does that
prog
disqualify them as
even,
a Death Doom band? No,
no,
they're still Death Doom.
it's the core of the sound
Mm-hmm.
has to be Death
Yeah.
Doom. You can add whatever, like Swallow Sun bringing in some black metal and prog, Asphyx bringing in thrash and hardcore at times, or crust punk even a little bit.
Yeah.
So, but with all that said, before we get into honorable mentions, I do want to mention who I think, in this case, is the true like proto band to the genre, and without this band, who knows if this genre would have even developed, because this band was so influential not just to this but to all of extreme metal. Celtic Frost. I
Mm-hmm.
would say
Yeah.
Celtic Frost was part of the reason why Death Doom happened, because when you look back on like Morbid Tales on a few tracks, but especially on To Megatherion, It's like they were so inspirational to death metal, black metal, doom, thrash,
basically everything.
basically
In metal.
everything that was going on at the same time or just about to happen. But
Yeah,
with
because Death
Megatherion,
Doom.
especially, like tracks like Dawn of Megiddo and Necromantical Screams, those are very doomy
Yeah.
songs. And with Tom Moyer's gruff ooh, which was very
Mm-hmm.
inspirational for
Yeah.
death metal vocalists. I look at
Yeah.
these two albums as like the pillar albums of what came afterwards, because then
Yeah.
you would see bands follow afterwards and kind of take what Celtic Frost did, but push it
Mm-hmm.
further and expand on it.
Yeah.
I would say
Because Death Doom, the earliest Death Doom that you can find. I mean, there's no pinpointing, but to me, the earliest Death Doom you can find probably the year of 89, 90s when it
like
began to start
the
around
like
that era.
we could say the first wave of Death Doom was like 89 through 92. I
Yeah,
would say
the
would be
first kind of wave began to do that. After that is when the whole Death Doom began to expand a bit more into different, because Death Doom is a more European dominant
much
genre,
more European.
much more European. Which there is something I want to do after we do our top 10, which probably people might like. So I'll say that to the end. But let's get into the main list. The honorable mentions.
So for some honorable mentions, now I'm doing my honorable mentions a little bit different. Whereas I was talking Celtic Frost just now, my honorable mentions are going to be three albums I would consider proto Death Doom. Like there were moments that made it feel like Death Doom, but these are straight up death metal albums, but definitely were like inspirational and kind of had some elements of what would it become around the time. But Bolt Thrower, Fourth Crusade,
Mm-hmm.
which, in my opinion, the best Bolt Thrower album. I know a lot of people like War Master more, and I understand, but I was a bigger fan of Fourth Crusade because of that more doomy side of their sound, which still appeared here and there on the remainder of their discography. But again, this was like a proto album because it's still just straight up old school death metal, but there was a lot of great doom moments, like As the World Burns, We're Next to Conquer, the title track all had some really good doom riffs in there because after all they were into Candlemass, Pentagram, and much more into Sabbath at this point, and especially coming off of one of their best albums, War Master, just a year later, and changing up their ways was bold. And also that album cover, holy shit.
Oh yeah, that's a brutal album cover. In terms of you know, both thrower album covers, that probably one of my favorites next to probably Realms of Chaos, but different story.
Then for my second one, we're going to get a little more evil on this one, and that is Incantation, Mortal Throne of
Yeah.
Nazarene. So I thought about actually going with Upon the Throne of Apocalypse since they're basically the same album but in reverse track order. You know what? Fuck it.
I could do it. Step to people.
Fuck it.
You get this kind
Both.
of weird mixtures of different. Trust me, that's why I love this genre so much.
So both of these are essentially the same album, but reverse track order and different recordings. Like this was the original recording, this was the re-recording. But both albums, every song is fucking amazing. And while again, more death metal, I would argue it's a little bit death doom as well because you get a lot of songs on these albums that carry that doom exterior, like Demonic Incarnate, the Ibex Moon, but especially the monstrous Abolishment of Immaculate Serenity. That is, I would say, one of the best death doom songs, period, because it's just evil and raw and murky and almost feels like you're being sent to hell listening to that song.
Pretty
And
much, yeah.
the way they
Yeah.
do it is just masterful.
Mm-hmm.
And then my final honorable mention, an album near and dear to my heart, Obituary, Cause of Death.
Yeah.
Now, there's the other debate. Would you consider Obituary Death Doom? Because they are very slow as well. Kind of almost like Autopsy, but maybe a little more mid-tempo than doomy. But there are some doomy riffs on here, like Infected, the opening track, like that opening riff is doomy. But for me, the only thing that disqualifies them from being Death Doom is much more groove oriented than Doom oriented. Even though they have moments of Doom, it's not quite enough to be Death Doom. But this is an important album. I think that some Death Doom bands would take some inspiration from because of their more slower vibe compared to their contemporaries like Morbid Angel and Death from the Florida scene at the time. So, but yeah, Cause of Death. Well, Ricky, your honorable mentions.
I have 15 honorable mentions. Yeah, people, trust me, this list was the hardest list I ever had to do. So, bear with me, guys. So, first of all, I have Trees of Eternity, Hour of the Nightingale. Even though it's not really Death Doom, I had to put it
More
on the list because it's
atmospheric
more
Doom, but yeah.
atmospheric, more gothic metal. Of course, Aaliyah Starbridge, God Rid Her Soul. This was a side project from Juha from Swallow the Sun, and of course they did this, and you know it was the only album they ever did together until her untimely passing. Which it's sad that it kind of happened, but it's still an amazing album. If you want something more gothic in your Death Doom, give this a listen. I have also Saturnus, Paradise Belongs to You. This was their debut album back in 1990. I want to say 97. Again, a bit more mellow Death Doom in that side perspective. Again, Saturnus, one of those bands that's not really mentioned as much, which is a shame because I really think they're one of the few metal Death Doom bands that really helped develop the genre. Bands like Fall of Sun later on, and so on and so forth. We have also Draconian. And I went with Arcane Rain Fell, their 2005 album release. I could have gone with the latest album, which it's an amazing album, but with Draconian, the early stuff. I mean, at first it was more borderline gothic metal, but at some point they kind of went more into more the Death Doom realm. And to me, this album, Arcane Rain Fell, is probably to me their quintessential album in my opinion. We also have Daylight Dies, this Mandarin Devotion, again, another big underground Death Doom band that doesn't get a lot of recognition, that should
Basically
get
like
more
American Swallow
recognition.
the Sun, essentially.
Pretty much, yeah, around there. Here's another one that's gonna be a lot of people are gonna be debating it's either Death Doom or not. Tales from the Thousand Lakes from Amorphous. The first two Amorphous albums, to me, are kind of Death Doomish. The only reason I put them honorable mention was because I think Tales from the Thousand Lakes to me it's more almost a bit more death metal than Death Doom, but still
More
as
prog mellow death.
yes. So in that perspective, I think Tales from the Thousand Lakes is a bit better than their debut album. To me, has more mellow in it.
Yeah.
November's Doom, Pale Horse Departure. I get probably basically the brother of Swallow's son, pretty much.
The
So
Big Brother,
another
since they were
the
around
big brother, yeah,
forever. Yeah.
they've been around since God,
90.
like 90. Like this was during the time around maybe around the same time Paradise Lost was starting to come a big part. But
And
again,
also,
another.
and also, yeah, fun fact with that album in particular, that was the album that got Dan Swano back to becoming a mixer master producer after
Mhm.
years of stopped doing it because he was busy with bands. And yeah, like Dan Swano talked about in that interview 2 years ago, it's like he thought he was done mixing and stuff like that, but November's Doom called him up and wanted him to do it. And he was at first like, nah, I'm retired, but come on. I'll do it. And he's
Mhm.
been producing,
Yeah.
mixing ever since. And that was
And
2004,
yeah. And
18 years ago.
for some reason, Dan Swano has a lot of involvement with Death Doom bands, but has never done a Death Doom project himself. So,
The
Swano, if you're
closest the
watching this,
closest he got was Moon Tower, but that's like
yeah,
prog mellow
yeah.
death.
So, Swano, if you're watching this, please make a Death Doom project. I would really love it, please. Um, Next up we have Rapture with Faulted. Again, their album from 1999. Another more underground kind of Death Doom band that doesn't people don't talk about a lot, which they should. Um, Thor's Hammer, Dos Mengaste EP back in '98, one of the early, not the earliest, but one of the few early American. Even though they really didn't develop into an album, this EP is regarded as probably one of the most hidden gems in Death Doom in the American scene, next to like Winter, Into Darkness, which we'll talk about later.
And
Um,
Runhild, the vocalist, who's a Norwegian lady, and she has one of the most guttural growls ever.
hmm
Just as guttural as people like Corpse Grinder, I would say.
yeah, yeah. I mean, another one, Cyanide, The Dying Truth, another American Death Doom band
American
that really,
Asphyx, essentially.
yeah. Which at the time they, again, at the time this was the early development of Death Doom. They didn't know what they were gonna catalyze this. They weren't like, oh, we're gonna make Death Doom. They just went out there and just played slow death metal, pretty much.
Hmm.
This was in '92 out of Chicago, if I remember correctly. So
From
again,
same place November's Doom came from.
yeah. So again, Chicago, another one of those weird places with death. And so
And
just
death
to show
metal
you
as a
that,
whole, and death metal as a whole,
yeah,
Broken Hope came from
pretty
Chicago.
much,
And actually,
yeah.
Brian Griffin, the guitarist of Broken Hope, actually did some work with Cyanide and November's Doom early on,
hmm
production wise.
Yeah. Canatonia, Brave Murder Day. Um, yes, I do consider that a really influential album, but in terms of
But not
legend
the
wise,
legend banger.
I mean, to be honest, if you would have told me which one's your favorite Canatonia album, I would go with December of Souls, which I'll talk about later. But again, still influential to the genre. This was what in 1990
6.
and 96. So again, this was during the time that Gothic metal was beginning to blow up. So around
And
that,
also, Michael Ockerfeld from Opeth on vocals. Well, the growls. He did have
the
one track, the
Grouse.
song Day, where Jonas Rinsk does the cleans.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you realize,
Yeah.
damn, this band's much more talented than just playing Death Doom. And then that would be their last Death Doom album before they would
Yeah.
go down Gothic Doom, alternative metal, prog
Prague.
now.
Yeah. The thing that pretty much Anathema should have done. There, I said it.
Yes. Basically where
um,
Anathema should have went to, or
yeah.
went through.
October Tide, Rain Without End. I mean, from '97. Again,
Side project
more
of Catatonia.
exactly another great, great Death Doom album. Unholy from the Shadows from '93. A good Finnish band from Finland. Another underground kind of hidden gem in Death Doom. Um,
Kind of almost bringing a little bit of like avant-garde black metal influence a little
yeah,
bit too,
pretty much.
because they got really really
Um,
weird with some like tribal beats and bongo stuff.
yeah. Desire, Infinity, a timeless journey through an emotional dream, and I mean, one of the earliest bands out of Death Doom in Portugal and Lisbon, to be honest, around Archer's wheelhouse. So, I was like, I had to put this on the list. Kind of mixture of black metal. So, this is one of the early bands, besides Swallow Sun, that kind of wanted to mix more black metal into Death Doom. So, again, another great pioneer in because Portugal has a lot of Death Doom in the, you know, perspective of that. We also have Decompose with Hope Finally Died, their album from 1993. This was an album that they released back in, of course, in the early development of Death in the UK with bands like My Dying Bride and Asthma, maybe Catatonia, and maybe Enchantment around there. Underground Death Doom, and somebody please release this album again. No one should pay close to $200 for this album. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Luckily, I didn't pay that much. I paid like maybe like $20, and it's the original print, so I'm happy for that. And the last but not least, last honorable mention is Enchantment with their '94 album, which is which I forget, Dance the Marble, not Dance the Marble Naked, which they released their second album just a couple of weeks ago, so I'm gonna check that out. But again, another band that should be more recognized because after this came out during that peak of Death Doom with bands like Anathema, My Dying Bride, and of course Paradise Lost, they kind of were pushed back. But give this guys a listen. You're really gonna love it. I mean, you like the My Dying Bride kind of sound, you're gonna love Enchantment.
And then, of course, one last one, because I figured you would have had it on the list, but because I like to say it, Ripicoliu Musta Sermonia, that EP,
Yes, actually, I'm
kind
gonna
of
save that for.
companion,
Yes, I'm
with
gonna. Yes,
Unholy.
yeah, I'm gonna save that for like the thing I'm gonna do after we do our list.
So, without further ado, time
Oh,
to
we
get
forgot
in.
Archer's. We forgot
Oh
Archer's
yeah,
honorable mention.
Archer's list. Yeah.
Let me go and get his list. So for Archer, he had a couple honorable mentions. Of course, he had Paradise Lost, Lost Paradise, which again, I was expecting him to go in that round. He has some Aesthetic, the Marble Value, which is another great, great Death Doom. Swallow the Sun, The Morning Never Came, which again, another album that's really gotten more recognition, but to me, that album is a bit more mellow death than Death Doom. To me, Swallow the Sun began becoming more Death Doom after maybe the Ghost of Lost when they become more Death Doom, in my opinion. Dusk, Majesty threw in the Ruin, another great album that I forgot to put in the honorable mentions. And the last honorable mention, he put again November's Doom, The Pale Hunt Departure.
But now on to the actual top 10. So my number 10 and my number 9 are basically like yin and yang. But my number 10, Triptychon, Melana Chasmata. Triptychon, of course, Tom Moyer, Celtic Frost, going back to what I was talking about with Celtic Frost, how important they were to the development of Death Doom because of their early works. We get Triptychon here, and this is 2014, so this isn't the latest one. That comes a little bit later. But, I mean, songs like Tree of Suffocating Souls, Bullskin House, Breathing, In the Sleep of Death, Black Snow. I mean, just dark, haunting, evil sounding. And what makes Triptychon unique is because it's more avant-garde Death Doom, essentially, because they're very experimental with what they do. But yeah, Melana Chasmata, it was one of the best albums that came out in 2014, I would say, up there with Accept and At the Gates and Behemoth that year. But yeah, Triptychon, Melana Chasmata, my number 10. My number 9 is the yang.
Nine.
Is the yang to the yin. Celtic Frost, Monotheist.
Yes.
Because I'm also one of the best comeback albums of all time because it was after
Mhm.
16 years of waiting, after an underrated gem with Vanity Nemesis, then broke up a couple years after, got back together in 2001, started the writing for this, and finally in 2006 we get it. And basically, Triptychon is just an extension of this album right here because this was completely different from anything you'd heard Celtic Frost do previous. Like here, much more dark, much more somber, heavier guitar tones. Like guitar
Mhm.
tone achieved right here. Like Jesus thing
Mhm.
is heavy. Also, it's Peter Tattergren from Hypocrisy that produced this. But yeah, songs like Progeny and Ground. Like Progeny, definitely a little more thrashy. But then you get to songs like Ground, A Dying God Coming into Human Flesh, which is this atmospheric, dark tune. Drown in Ashes, Os Abysmi Valdath, Obscured. And then the 3-part triptych finale with Totengod, which is like atmospheric, ambient, like horror movie thing. Then you get to their
Mhm.
14.5-minute epic, Synagoga Satanae, which is super doomy. And then you end off with a classical piece to conclude all this. But yeah, definitely I would say a lot of Death Doom that came out after this took inspiration from this album. Even the old guard of Death Doom, I would say, kind of went down this rabbit hole. Like Asphyx, I feel like kind of went down the rabbit hole of Monotheist a little bit with some of the riffs and the darkness. So yeah, I'd say this is an important one to modern Death Doom since
Yeah.
2006. My number 8. I bet Ricky's going to have this one higher on his list. Winter into Darkness.
Yep. Higher on the list.
I mean, yeah, basically American Celtic Frost, I would say, but much more slow because, after all, Winter, they took the name from the album by Amoebics, which was a crust punk band that was inspirational on Winter. But here it's like vocally, it's like the more gross Tom Weir almost. And there's a lot, and also this is kind of one of the early albums in the genre that began to incorporate more of like that almost dark ambient element because there would be some
Mhm.
moments on songs where not a whole lot's going on. It's more about setting the mood. But some of the rhythms and the riffs you get definitely harken back to Celtic Frost to Megatherion, especially in tracks like Eternal Frost and Destiny. But yeah, like Servants of the Warsmen, was a very catchy song.
Mm-hmm.
Godin or Godin's another highlight for me. I mean, top to bottom, it's murky, it's a bummer, but it's raw and nasty and gritty, which is
Mm-hmm.
really, really cool. 1990, so right in that first wave period as well. So, yeah, if you are a fan of old Celtic Frost, but you want to hear what they would sound like if they were slower, this is the album for you. My number 7, the only album I actually don't have in the collection right now, but my number 7, My Dying Bride, Turn Loose the Swans. Their second album, and really the
Mm-hmm.
last one to be exclusively Death Doom. Like, there's still some Death
Yeah.
Doom in their music afterwards, but even by with this album, Turn Loose the Swans, you already could hear they were going to go down the gothic metal route. Like, as the Flower Withers, the first album the year prior, definitely much more Death Doom, but I don't think it was as influential as Turn Loose the Swans. I mean, songs like, what's the name of that one that I always forget?
Sear Me,
No, not that one.
the title track.
No, The Songless Bird.
Mm.
That's the one that stood out to me the most about this album because you get those really cool, like, classical moments before you get into some heavy evilness.
Yeah. And
Now,
My
this
Dying
is
Bride
where.
was, oh, I was gonna say My Dying Bride was one of the few bands that started to incorporate the neoclassical into Death Doom, which will get along to more like the more melodic Death Doom.
Yeah, so these guys were kind of like early innovators in that sense. Now, this is where it gets a little bit debatable for me because even bands like My Dying Bride, for me, the only reason why I don't think they would be considered like the true pioneer is because this is where the mixture changes. Like, this is more like 30% death metal, 70% doom, I would say. So they were definitely much more doom than anything else, but had
Mm-hmm.
enough death to be in the conversation. But that's basically where
Yeah.
it kind of it's where the lines get blurred at
And
times.
again, that's where the lines get blurry because Gothic metal's more close to the Gothic
And
metal. 'Cause
even
Gothic
gothic
metal.
metal took a lot of inspiration from early death doom too, well, depending on the band. Of course, the true
Mm-hmm.
pioneers, Typo Negative, that did not have any death doom.
No, that had more Sabbath influence, but like a band like maybe what can I say? Like I said, My Dying Bride kind of went too in the camps because early was Death Doom, in the
Then
middle
they
was
got
kind of
more
more
gothic, but still
Gothic.
having a little bit of
Yeah,
death doom attached,
yeah.
just
It
not as
wasn't until
much.
recently where they kind of combined both the Death Doom and the Gothic metal with the neoclassical, which it's a good sound for them. But at the beginning, the first two My Dying Bride albums were in quintessential Death Doom. After that, more Gothic.
But now on to number 7. Oh, Ricky, you're gonna fall out of your chair right now. My number 6, Songs from the North 1, 2, and 3. Now, of course, this is a unique one because it's 3 discs. This is the longest album out of them all for obvious reasons. But what makes this album unique is because we both are big Swallow the Sun fans. Him more so than me. I mean, he's got the shirt. But by this point, 2015, they were really evolving big time, and it shows with this because all 3 discs is something totally different. Disc 1 is really what puts this album on the list because that's the core Swallow the Sun sound, the melodic Death Doom sound. Disc 2, all acoustic. Then you get to Disc 3 where they're showing that they could be a great funeral doom band.
Hmm.
So, but it's Disc 1, Gloom, is what put the album on the list because songs like Rooms and Shadows, one of my favorites that they've ever done, Silhouettes, Lost in Catatonic, 10 Silver Bullets, Wish You Came, Whole of the World's Tears, the opening track, easy for
Hmm.
me to say. Yeah, just top to bottom, great stuff. And, of course, the growls. Like, not as much of, like, that black metal scream, definitely more of the guttural growls, but with
Hmm.
great clean vocals too. Of course, now I think his cleans are better now, especially on the new album, but still very
Yeah,
strong on
yeah.
this one.
Miko's vocals have been improving lately because I think he
Since he
went
got clean,
sober
yeah.
and he got
Yeah.
clean.
But yeah, that's my number 6. Now for my top 5, we're going to get into my personal faves out of the genre. And at number 5, I could have went with the new album. I could have went with their third album. But I went with their amazing sophomore effort, 2010, Hooded Menace, Never Crossed the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
This is, to me, what I think Death Doom should be. And that's brutal, heavy, melodic, and gross. And I think what Hooded Menace did was basically take the inspiration of early Paradise Lost, Autopsy, Asphyx, and Candlemass, mix it together, and you get some of the most brutal Death Doom you'll ever hear, especially vocally. Like Lasse Pico, the main man behind Hooded Menace, he was the vocalist up until 2018 with Ossuarium Silhouettes Unhallowed. But his vocals harken back to like people like Frank Mullen from Suffocation and Michael Ockerfeld from Opeth and Bloodbath. Like, they're much more evil and demonic. Whereas like their current vocalist, Hari, definitely kind of has a bit of like a combination of like Dan Swano, David Vincent, and Corpse Grinder. But here with Never Cross the title track, I love how it starts off fading in with that awesome riff, and then it just gets into like sinister territory before it just gets fucking gruesome. Terror Castle is another great track from their Confined Slumber. The House of the Hammer, Night of the Death Cult. Top to bottom, this album is perfect. Even the closing track, theme from Return of the Evil Dead, where they do that song and and it's like almost like what would happen if Autopsy did like a slow Death Doom instrumental. Because this album is so Autopsy inspired, but at the same time very Asphyx, very early Paradise Lost, Candlemass, even like there's some Candlemass riffs, Sabbath, all over the place. Like I said, I could have went with Effigies of Evil. I could have went with Trident Bell, the new one, because I love that album. But I went with, I think, their best work because of how heavy it is. Arguably, next to Monotheist and another album I'm going to talk about later, for the heaviest Death Doom album, perhaps. But yeah, Never Crossed the Dead. Number 4, I would say, like, what bands like My Dying Bride started, this band basically took that and perfected it and truly pioneered what bands like November's Doom and Swallow the Sun and Daylight Dies would do. Catatonia, Dance of December Souls. 1993, right at the very start of their career, like they'd only gotten together like a year and a half prior. And it was just two guys, Jonas Rinsk and Anders Nystrom, who would become important players to not just the genre, but all of metal because of everything they've done. Not just in Catatonia, but other bands like October Tide, Bloodbath especially. But with Catatonia, and it's great the story behind how this album was created. The two guys, and basically it was like Anders doing guitar and bass, Jonas drums and vocals. And they were such fanboys of Edge of Sanity that they sent a letter to Dan Swano saying, hey, we got a band, we love you and Edge of Sanity. Would you like to do something with us? Hell yeah, absolutely. And did their Java Elohim Meth EP that came out a year before this. And then went back to Swano to produce this one, and Swano doing keyboards. Of course, by this time they had a bass player. Let's see if I can find his name. I can't find his name. He went under a name like a Raffle Wing. Is Raffle Wing was his stage name, I guess. Like Black Heim, Lord Seth. But this album, you want to talk about depressing. Oh my god. Like, if you thought Swallow the Sun was depressing, if you thought My Dying Bride was depressing, this is where it came from. Especially with tracks like Gateways of Bereavement, Without God, and especially Velvet Thorns, which is my favorite Catatonia song. And what made this unique, it's also very proggy too. Like, I would consider this like progressive death doom, melodic death doom, and even a little bit of black metal in
Mm-hmm.
there too, because
Yeah.
Yona's vocals were a little more torturous, almost like mixing like Martin Van Drunen from Pestilence and Asphyx and Wagner from Sarcophago, kind of mixing them together, and that was Yona's uh, vocal delivery on here. I mean, just sad, sad stuff. Is like I said, especially with Gateways of Bereavement and no doubt with Velvet Thorns. Long songs, too, like again, showcasing their progressive influence. And I think that kind of came from Swano's influence on here, too. Of course, Brave Murder Day to follow up, just as good, but in a different sense. Like, it was a little heavier, a little more gothic, whereas here was basically Death Doom taken to the more melodic side and on the dark, depressing side. So basically, without this album, you wouldn't have Swallow the Sun. You would not have November's Doom. Maybe not even My Dying Bride afterwards, in all honesty. So,
Yeah.
this is where that kind
Around
of
there.
came from. Number 3, speaking of, like, Peaceville bands, we get to the godfather of the Peaceville era, Paradise Lost, Lost Paradise.
Really? You haven't lost Paradise? Really?
Because I think this is more Death Doom than Gothic. Like, Gothic could have been a good choice, but I feel like even with that album in the title, you already heard where they was going to go for the rest of their career. Whereas here, with Lost Paradise, more raw, more heavy, more evil sounding. Definitely they were inspired by Autopsy at this point, especially with Deadly Inner Sins, the song Paradise Lost, Our Savior, Rotting Misery. I mean, songs like Our Savior have some of their most death metal inspired moments, especially drum work, like the double bass, the like breakdowns. But yeah, like Deadly Inner Sense, you definitely hear like those like slow autopsy riffs kind of coming in. And of course, Nick Holmes, who has become a pillar to metal today with not only his growls, but also his cleans. Like, I always considered like his more gruff cleans to be on the same level as James Hetfield. Like, to me, he's like the British James Hetfield, clean vocal wise. Whereas his death growls, definitely much more creepy, and you can tell why Bloodbath wanted him to join the band after Michael left, and is still in Bloodbath to this day. And I feel like because of him being in Bloodbath was what led to Paradise Lost since Plague Within going back to this era a little bit, but mixing it with their gothic metal stuff. So it's like a good balance. So while this kind of started the theme with a lot of the early Death Doom, where it's like 2 albums, we're going to move on to something else. But Paradise Lost is one of the only originators that, yeah, they started that way, but have now gone back to this style, but mixing it with their middle goth era like Icon and Draconian Times. But yeah, Paradise Lost. Lost Paradise. Now for my number 2. While I could have put this in Proto, but for me, this is pure Death Doom. Definitely more on the death metal side, for obvious reasons, but enough Doom to be on here. Autopsy, Mental Funeral. I mean, this is probably the most brutal album out of the list, for obvious reasons. I mean, that album cover screams brutality. And what was unique with Autopsy is, like, even with Severed Survival, the first album, definitely much more death, definitely a death metal album, but you had moments of doom. It wasn't like the focal point. Whereas we get 2 years later, in 91, they were really into Sabbath and St. Vitus and Trouble at this point. And they even admit that in the liner notes. So they wanted to mix that with what they've already established. And yes, lots of thrashy moments on here, but there's more doom moments on here too, with tracks like In the Grip of Winter, Torn from the Womb, Slaughter Day, Dead, Hole in the Head, Fester or Destined to Fester. Great doomy stuff, and like the thrash moments kind of enhance the brutality of this album, with especially in like Twisted Massive, Burnt Decay, Dark Crusade, and even in Hole in the Head, just to have some of those thrashy breaks to really kind of keep their old school death metal sound alive, but bringing in the doom to create something more atmospheric and more murky. And without this album, who knows where you would see bands like Hooded Menace and modern bands
Mm-hmm.
like Spectral Voice, Cryptic Brood, Temple of Void, especially. But yeah, Autopsy. Which brings me to my number one. For me, the true pioneer of Death Doom, since they started earlier than everybody else. Well, the same year as Autopsy, but
Mm-hmm.
this band took what Autopsy was trying to do and perfected it to create what I think real Death Doom should sound like. And that is Asphyx, Last One on Earth. 1992. They already had an album before this, The Rack, the year prior. But yeah, started in 87, out of the Netherlands. Many lineup shifts early on, demos, demo album, Embrace the Death, which did get eventually re-released in 96, but recorded in 90. But really what got them established was the fact they got one of the best death metal vocalists of all time, Martin Van Drunen, from Pestilence after their best album, Consuming Impulse. Asphyx bring him in on bass and vocals and changed the game forever. The Rack was a hell of a debut, but Last One on Earth, much more doomy, much more dark, brutal, and I would argue the heaviest, the true heaviest Death Doom album. The guitar tone is massive. The vocals, Martin, how do you do it still to this day to sound like you're
I
being asphyxiated, essentially?
He's a freak of nature. He's a
He
freak
is
of
a
nature.
freak of nature and a hell of a guy, too, from what I hear. But yeah, songs like The Crusher, that fucking riff, that dun, 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 dun,
Mhm.
fucking Doom to the Bone, the title track, their best song they ever did. 7 minutes of just masterful stuff. And yes, definitely a lot of thrash moments, again, and hardcore and crust, but it doesn't overpower the Doom. Like, they use the Doom as a way to set the mood for the thrash and for the mid-tempo stuff. Even their self-titled song, Asphyx Forgotten War, kind of like brings it all together. Streams of Ancient Wisdom, which actually was a re-recording of the song they had early in their demo days. Serenade and Lead, MS Bismarck, Incarnation of Lust, Food for the Ignorant. And Food for the Ignorant has one of the heaviest Doom breakdowns ever, where it's like dun 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 dun, and it just sounds like shit's blowing up in the background too.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, really top to bottom, their whole catalog is good to outstanding. Like The Rack, their self-titled album, Embrace the Death, God Cries is alright, On the Wings of Inferno, underrated, and then From Death to Brutal Way through to Necrosaurus have been on a hell of a tear going to this day. And Asphyx, for me, the true inventor of the genre, and have stayed the course the longest, because during the era when Paradise Lost and My Dying Bride and Catatonia was like, I got 2 records, let's just move on to something else. More than 2 albums that they've stuck the course. So that automatically makes them pioneers, is the fact they stayed the course, didn't change, and have just kept the genre alive for forever. But that's enough from me. What about Archer's list before we get to yours?
Let's see. Let me go to Archer's list. Here we go. So at number 10, he had Disembowelment Transcend into the Peripheral. At number 9, Amorphous Tales of a Thousand Lakes. And number 8, Under Godless Veil, which I kind of had a feeling he was going to put that, since I think that was his album of the year that came out. At number 7, My Dying Bride, Turn Loose the Swans. At number 6, Mental Funeral by Autopsy. Number five, Desire, Infinity, a timeless journey through an emotional dream. Um, at number four, Winter, Into Darkness. At number three, Brave Murder Day, Gothic by Paradise Lost, and his number one, Last One on Earth by Asphyx.
All right, now Ricky, let's hear it.
So again, this was the hardest list I ever had to do because this is my wheelhouse. So I kind of tried to make it 50-50 in terms of like half of the list being brutal death doom, the other kind of being metal death doom. It kind of went 60-40, more or less. But let's get into the list. So at number 10, I have Mental Funeral by Autopsy. I mean, brutality at its finest. Yeah, Super Survival was more death metal, but this time they became more death doom. Which when you have a song like maybe what's the song that I like the most? In the Grips of Winter. My God, that's so heavy
that melodic,
brutality.
that
Oh,
melodic break
yeah,
at towards the end. That
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So for some people who don't think that Autopsy is death doom, you're kind of right. They help pioneer the genre. They're not really core death doom, but again, they pioneer the genre. So again, if you want a kind of an early or American start to death doom, Autopsy Super
that's a
Survival
good
might be
one.
your perfect way to start. At number nine, we have kind of modern s quote unquote, even though it's not really modern. It's more of a 2002 kind of release. I have Morning Benevolent, The Sullen, Succubus. Solak, not Sullen. So this was one of the albums that took me the longest time to find on CD because for some weird reason it's hasn't been reissued, but thankfully I got it for a couple of maybe like $15. But the thing I like about this album is that it's more metal death doom, but incorporates a bit of black metal, a bit of prog metal. Even sometimes it even goes to even more not funeral doom because again there's a borderline that they try not to do, but the whole thing puts you on a journey in the somber and the sadness. The lyrics, I mean, to me, my favorite track is probably the intro track, "The World That Crawled." That kind of haunting vocals with the growls just brings it all together, and you know it's a great Def Doom album, an underrated Def Doom album that a lot of people should listen to more. So at number nine, The Stolen Solak by Morning Benevolent. At number eight, yep, we have here another Def Doom band that's not really doesn't have a lot of recognition. It's from the Netherlands and it should get more recognition. Of course, I'm talking about Reason by Officium Priest. Officium Priest is probably like my top five favorite Def Doom bands of all time. And again, no more the sombering kind of Def Doom, but they make it more grandiose to the point that actually began you want more and more and more. And they've been on a tear since their debut album back in 1990. I want to say 1994, and they led them to their latest album, In the Death of Gaia, in 2019. They've been being consistent, melodic, Def Doom, which again shows the capacity of this band. And again, not many people know about Efficient Trees, which is a shame that more people should listen to them and discover that there's another side of life and music that you should really enjoy and make it more, I guess, meaningful. So at number eight, Official Trees by recent Official Trees. Number seven is the only album I don't have on my list, which is Marty by Saturnus. I mentioned Saturnus previously, in honorable mentions, but of course belongs to you. But I think to me that Saturnus began to capture their sound in this album. From the album cover, which is one of the most beautiful yet sad album covers I've ever seen, is an angel in a river, kind of being tied up, kind of almost dead like, which to me that kind of spoke to me. I'm like, this has to be some sad, depressing Death Doom, man. At times it is, but it's more again, it's more metal Death Doom, but it's not as sad as you might think. It has a bit more of a brighter side, which is kind of weird thing about a Death Doom, which it's not really a yin and yang that kind of thing. But again, it's a really good album that you might want to check out eventually and try good luck finding it. I've been trying it for years, and if you want to spend close to maybe $150 on it, good fucking luck. Which again, they should reissue it again, please. I'm just saying. At number six, it's the only time I have an instant three-way time, and of course, I'm talking about the Peaceful Three, which of course means Classic by Paradise Lost, Turn Loose the Swans by My Dying Bride, and The Silent Enigma by Anathema. I'm just getting it out of the way. Anathema, after the fifth album they did, they went shit. But to me, Anathema, the first two albums, pure Death Doom. The latter three, more about Death Doom kind of gothic kind of sound. But to me, Anathema was one of the weird bands out of the Peaceful Three, which a lot of people say they shouldn't be in it, they should not be in. I think they should be in it because of what they tried to do in the early days of Death Doom. And this was the first album that the guitarist, I remember his name, I think it's Dan. He actually took vocals after the previous vocalist kind of left the band. So, he was on guitar and vocals and damn good vocals at the time. So, again, Anathema, I give him a lot of shit for what they've been lately, but I hope if they ever go back to those roots again, I would really love it. But again, a man can dream. With Turn to the Swans, yes, again, two albums left to him. After that, then kind of went whole different thing. But to me, My Dying Bride to me began their infamous. I mean, I could have gone with as the Flower Withers, which is more close to aspects kind of Death Doom, but to me, this was when they're trying to incorporate more of the violin and the piano and the more neoclassical kind of stuff in Death Doom, which eventually with bands like maybe like Follow Sun, or Fusion Trees, One and Beloved would level develop. So to me, in terms of metal Death Doom, in my time, Red was one of the early pioneers, so that's why a lot of people regard as probably the big one on the Peaceful Three. So I kind of see that argument. And with Gossip to Paradise Lost, again, this was one of the first albums that they went to drop C, which at the time was really not common. They was always standard or kind of
Half
like a
step
eight
down or D
half
tuning,
step
or even
down,
C sharp.
urban C sharp. So it kind of went drop C like a really really down drop C, which kind of gave it a bit of flavor to the album. And I mean, for a lot of people, it's probably their favorite, which is my favorite. And you know, eventually they kind of went more the gothic metal with Draconian Times, which amazing album. And then they kind of had a bit of a dark period where we're kind of a bit
Where
industrial
they
in a way,
went
which
kind of Depeche Mode almost.
yeah. And then actually they get up a renaissance at the late, which my God, their latest work is amazing.
Plague
Kind of
Within
a bit
through Obsidian, yeah.
yeah. But to me, Gothic has always been the stand up Paradise Lost album. Of course, Lost Paradise, huge influential on the genre as well. But to me, Gothic was the one that kind of inspired the more Death Doom. Of course, the Gothic metal scene as well. So, for those reasons, I have all those for number six. Now we're up to the top five. At number five, Anatolia, Dance of December Souls. Talk about depressing. I mean, at the earliest stages of Death Doom, this is probably one of the most depressive albums Death Doom albums you ever hear. When you incorporate black metal esque elements to it, which at the time you never thought black metal and death and doom would never mix. Somehow, some way, Canatonia kind of made it work to the point that,
Well,
of course,
even before then, you had bands like Goat Lord that kind of was doing that too. That
well,
mixed
yeah,
all
but
three
I mean, at the
together.
time,
But
this was
yeah,
what in 1993,
3.
93. Of course, this was still during the big boom in the Norwegian black metal, scene, which is a different story. But I mean, of course, Dan Swano playing the keyboards, producing the album. Which again, Dan Swano, when are you gonna release a Def Doom project? I've been saying that for years. You know, he's been involved with so many Def Doom projects, and I'm like, it's about time
He
he
even
makes
did
one.
mastering for recent Asphyx albums too.
Exactly. So I'm like, Dan Swano, what are you waiting for? Please. But to me, Gateways of Everett, oh my God, that's so depressing and beautiful. The tone of vocals are close to black metal, but it's so fucking good. And again, Brave Murder Day, influential, but not the legend. Like, it's a mixed bag. At number 4, Songs from the North, 1, 2, and 3. I had to put Swallow Sun on the list. I could have gone with any of their albums. I could have gone with The
There's
Shadows
merits to
Force into
put any
the
of them on there.
Yeah, I could have gone with The Shadows Force into the Light, but I've said it before. That's my favorite Swallow Sun album, but it's not the most influential. I could have gone with The Ghost of Lost, which is when they began more of the Death Doom sound to it. But to me, Songs from the North is their, you know, their epic, their most ambitious album. For them to have a 3 albums, that says a lot about them. I mean, of course, the first part being the more traditional metal death doom, when you have songs like Rooms and Shadows, Heartstrings Shattering, The Memory of Light, From Happiness to Dusk. I mean, songs that they still play to this day. You get the second album, which is a more acoustic, kind of more down to earth, kind of campfire esque album, with of course the winter before the summer dies, and then of course the third album, Despair, they go really funeral doom, which and Mikkel's vocals, if they didn't get better this time, they got immensely better in the later albums, but at this time his vocals were some of the most brutal. I mean, he could go down and low, like extremely low, which you know get to show how much Swallow Sun tries to incorporate so much, like black metal, death metal, doom metal, prog metal. They're just all over the place. But again, Song from the North 1, 2, 8, 3 at number 4. At number 3, numero 3, Winter into Darkness. So funny story about this album. Leah and I actually bought it separately, and then we got it at the same time. And then a week later, they re-released it, which I'm like, what the fuck? After
Right.
looking it for a long time, but like Levi said, of course, this is what would happen if you want a more Celtic Cross kind of sound to it. Not really Celtic Cross, but if you wanted something close to it, this is the album. Again, at this time, they didn't know what they were playing. Again, who knows what they were at the time? No one considered them being Death until probably the 2000s. Were like, oh shit, they really sound like Death Doom esque.
Hmm.
But pioneers of Death Doom, and this was what 1990,
1990.
1990 actually 1990. So the early stages of Death Doom, American Death Doom. Actually, no, Canadian Death Doom, if I remember
American. They were
correctly.
from New York. They were from New
Yeah,
York.
yeah. Well, yeah. I always have the New York and kind of the scene kind of mixed up. But again, one of the few bands from the '90s from American Death Doom that kind of paved the way for not only American Death Doom but Death Doom in general. Of course, bands like Aspects, Hooded Menace, so on and so forth. So at number 3, we have Winter into Darkness.
And it's a shame that's the only album they ever did.
Yeah, one album. That's it. Call it a career.
Yep.
At number 2, Aspects Last One on Earth. First of all, from the album cover, when you have a fucking
Zombie Priest.
a zombie priest, automatically tells you this is gonna be a hell of an album. Once you go deep into the album, it goes so fast. Okay, that's like the first time I ever say it goes fast in Death Doom, but it has thrash, some bit of black metal, of course the Death Doom thing of it, Martin vocals. I mean, my God, to this day I don't know how the hell he does it. Sometimes I think he tries too much, and I'm afraid he's gonna lose his voice one of these days. But
Yet the man's in
I
his mid 50s and he sounds exactly the same as he did in late
yeah,
80s.
yeah. I mean, in terms of Death Doom bands, Aspects has been one of the most consistent in terms of brutal Death Doom or traditional Death Doom, whatever you want to call it.
Traditional
When you
Death
have a song
Doom.
like Last One on Earth, probably their best song of all time, have that.
Yeah, that opening riff.
My
And I love how that
God.
song ends whenever you get like the riff playing and then you hear like organs in the background
Mm-hmm.
kind of like enhancing that part.
Yeah. But I mean, I could have put it at number 1, but there's one album that I consider it more not really pioneer, but in terms of like top 5 Death Doom albums of all time, this has to be at the very, very, very top. At number 1, it's a band that I'm surprised Levi didn't mention. I was hoping he
I
doesn't
know
go. I
you're
guess
probably gonna say. I know you're
yeah,
probably gonna go with.
yeah, and of course,
Just
at number 1, we have right here to me, which is probably the greatest Def Doom album of all time because it has everything. It combines, bro, the brutality, the somber, the melodic, the atmosphere of Def Doom to me. At number one, Disembowelment transcends into the peripheral. A one album done from this Australian band back in 1993, one album, call it a career. And at first, nobody knew what this was. It wasn't until probably the late 2000s where people began to find
Recognize
out
it
that this,
again.
yeah, that it had that ties to Def Doom, and of course, again, when you have a song like Your Poetic Throne of Ivory, The Tree of Life, that Somberlane kind of Death Doom growls, the atmosphere brings to me. The only way you can listen to this album properly is put in your stereo, go to the coldest room in your house, turn up the lights, and just listen to it in one take. You're gonna have so much emotion, so much sadness, but at the same time, kind of you're gonna be like, "What the fuck did I listen to?" And of course, like I said, to me, this is probably the greatest Death Doom album of all time. So, number one, this moment transcends the peripheral.
And if I may add on to that, also you like that's similar to Winter, the dark ambient music influence
Hmm.
coming in. But also what I think makes that album unique, there's a lot of sections on there that scream early grindcore. Like
Yeah.
especially the opening of Tree of Life and Death, it's very Napalm Death esque with the blasts and the big roar. It's like yeah, it's like that album almost kind of pushed the speeds a little bit to
Hmm.
its fastest and slowest. Because
True.
yes, you had a lot of sections in there that screamed early grindcore, but then, but that's also an example where it's like, say, after a while, because of that dark ambient elements, you could probably count how many snare hits in 30 seconds. Um, but yeah. And also, that album's kind of seen as like a bit of a godfather to Funeral Doom to some extent
Yeah.
because of how
Yeah.
slow it does get, but it's not quite there.
No, it's an borderline Funeral Doom because I remember the first time I listened to that album, I thought it was pure on Funeral Doom, but after giving it a couple of listens, I was like, this is Death Doom, pure on
Yeah.
mellow,
Because
brutal.
after all, in Death Doom, you don't get blast beats. Or Funeral Doom, you don't get blast beats.
You know.
So. But now, time to construct the actual top 10. I think safe bet Asphyx goes to number one. I think
Yeah,
that's a
pretty sure
safe
number
bet.
one. Asphyx also
That
number one.
goes. I'd say, like, for band, or for as far as albums, like Mental Funerals, a safe bet, because we all had
Yeah,
it. I
Winter
would
has to go
say,
in.
yeah, Into Darkness. I would
Songs
say
from the
Songs
North.
from the North.
Songs from the North has to
I would
be
say
there.
those. I would say, and then Turn Loose to Swans
Turn loose this ones.
and Dance of December Souls. So how
Yeah,
many is
those
that?
are
So
like the
Asphyx,
like
Autopsy,
five.
Swallow the Sun, My Dying Bride, Catatonia. So we got five.
So
Now for Paradise
I know you want to.
Lost.
I know you want to type them down before we forget.
Oh, let me
Yeah,
do that then.
yeah.
So
So we have, of course, Aspect, Last One on Earth, Winter to Darkness, Songs from the
Autopsy,
North.
Mental Funeral, Songs from
Yeah.
the North, and Turn Loose to
North.
Swans.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's see here.
Now, I guess I'll live with putting Gothic
Yeah.
instead of Lost
Yeah,
Paradise.
Gothic has to be there. To me, I mean, Archer and I have Gothic, so it has to be there. Um,
So that's
let's see.
6.
That's six. So,
Or actually, no, that's
uh,
7 because Into Darkness.
yeah.
I would say Hooded Menace needs to be up there,
The first one,
especially for
first would
modern
modern. Okay,
days. For
for
Never Crossed the
modern.
Dead.
Yeah, never crossed it. I mean, you gotta give me disembowelment. Give me disembowelment.
Yeah, Disembowelment should be there.
It
So
has to be there.
Disembowelment, and now it's that 10th spot. So that's that 10th spot. I mean, we got. Oh, what the fuck?
So I'm just trying to think the regions because we got Australia,
We
Finland,
got Netherlands,
Netherlands,
England,
the
America.
States. Okay, this is where. Okay, let's see here. My list. Oh, here it is. what else could go here?
I mean, one could make a case Celtic Frost could be in there.
I don't know about that, to be honest. I
Especially,
mean,
especially for modern times, with how Monotheist was so influential to what came after. Even the old guard kind of taking what they did. I'd say Monotheist would be a good choice.
yeah, fuck it. I'll throw you a bone. I'll throw you that bone.
Monotheist. So now, as far as the order, I say Asphyx. Asphyx goes to 1. 2,
Yeah.
I would say number 2, we could give that to Into Darkness.
Yeah, give it Into Darkness. Number 3, probably Disembowelment.
Yeah, hang on. Number 3, Disembowelment. Oh, hang on. I am trying to type as fast as I can. I'm fucking up. I always type like chicken pecks. I don't do that because I can't do that. Yeah. Transcendence into the peripheral. I'd say number 4, we could go Catatonia.
Yeah, Catatonia.
Dance of December Souls. Number 5, I could give that to Gothic.
Yeah, I can give it a Gothic, yeah.
Paradise Lost, Gothic. Then Swallow the Sun.
Songs from the North.
Swallow the Sun, Songs from the North. God damn it. Songs from the North. 7, Autopsy.
Yeah, Autopsy.
Autopsy, Mental Funeral. Number 8, Turn Loose the Swans.
Yeah, Turn Loose
then 9, Hooded Menace. Then 10, Celtic Frost.
Yes.
Turn Loose the Swans. 9, Hooded Menace. Never Cross the Dead. And number 10, Celtic Frost. Monotheist. Alright, well, there is our final top 10 Death Doom albums. At number 10, Celtic Frost, Monotheist. Number 9, Hooded Menace, Never Cross the Dead. Number 8, My Dying Bride, Turn Loose the Swans. Number 7, Autopsy, Mental Funeral. 6, Swallow the Sun, Songs from the North 1, 2, and 3. 5, Paradise Lost, Gothic. 4, Catatonia, Dance of December Souls. 3, Disembowelment, Transcendence into the Peripheral. Number 2, Winter into Darkness. And number 1, Asphyx, Last One on Earth.
Yeah, better Death Doom list than what Banger did, to be honest. I mean,
yes.
Which
by again, for recent Banger, that doesn't take much to be better than them. I'll go ahead and say the only guys at Banger I even care for anymore are DK and Pop Off, and to a lesser extent Dylan. Blaine, I don't like anymore. Sam's kind of borderline. Sarah, borderline. Their chick Riley can fuck off, so there you go. Even though she's hot, I don't like her.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah.
Well, there are other Sam's pretty cool too, though. But.
Yeah. So before we end the show, when I was doing research for this specific, episode, I was realizing that there's so much Death Doom out there that
there really is.
That
a lot we didn't even. A lot we can give shout outs to, like Cryptic Brood, Temple of Void, Spectral Voice. Yeah.
So I have a couple of bands I want to mention. Just a couple of bands. And I decided to separate them by country. And then by the end, we're going to figure it out which country might have the more Death Doom or region.
The best Death Doom scene.
Yeah. So from Portugal, we have 2 bands I want to mention. We have, of course, Ashes of Life with their album Ceases Within, released in 2020. And we have Speklos with Vasius, released in 2021. From Finland, we have, of course, Mariana's Rest, Fata Morgana. We have Hooded Menace, It Never Came the Dead, their 2007 release. We have Halatar, No Stars Upon the Bridge, one of the side projects from, of course, Jew Albert from Little Sun. We have Swallowed with their 2015 album, Lunaterio, kind of a more, I want to say, more blackened Death Doom. That's like the first thing I can mention.
And just another shout out. One of the best albums that came out last year, 1914, Where Fear and Weapons Meet, blackened Death Doom.
Yeah. Of course, Ribicolio with Musta Ceremonia, which finally got a reissue in Savat Records, which I
Smart
snatched already
Records,
together.
great reissue label in
Yeah,
Finland.
which I
That was
should
how
get
I
that on the
got the Convulsed World Without God album.
which I should get that album in the mail eventually in this couple of days. From Norway, Abyss, Hide the Memory from the 2019 album, kind of more symphonic Death Doom. From the country of Jordan, the Dead Sea with Hypernitrarium. Again, another kind of weird one man Death Doom project. From the States, we have a couple. From Florida, Druid Lord with the latest release, Relics of the Dead.
That's a hell of an album.
Yeah, brutal, guttural Death Doom.
Basically, like
Another one.
a continuation of early Hooded Menace.
Yes.
And another American one recent this year, Night Hag, their debut, Phantasmal
Yes.
Scourge.
Of course, from the Florida scene, we have Worm with Forever Glade, another kind of Black and Death Doom kind of thing.
Yeah.
From New York, we have Ceremonium Into the Autumn Shades, which was released in 1995. From Texas slash kind of the parts of Mexico, we have Majestic Downfall with Arrota with the 2021 album release. From Virginia, Night Hack with Phantasmal Scourge, another great new modern Death Doom project. From Michigan, we have Acid Witch with Witch Chanting Hallucinations with the 2008 release. And from
at one point, Acid Witch had Lasse from Hooded Menace in the band.
yes, Temple of Void with the latest release, Summoning the Slayer. Great Death Doom from, of course, Michigan. Now we're going to Spain. We have Evadne with the Pale Light of the Fireflies. Another kind of the sister of Solo Sun, if I like to call it, say so myself. Son of the Dying with The Earth is Still Silent, their 2018 album release. Shattered Side with their 22 album release, To the Dark Veils. From Italy, we have Invernier, The Void and the Unbreakable Loss from the 2020 album release, a more gothic kind of Death Doom kind of sound to it. From Greece, of course, on Thorstein Lane, Renos, they've been around since the 90s in Greece. I mean, Greece has always been one of the biggest scenes in metal in general. Of course, Oceans of Grief with Nightfall Lament, a 20 album release. From Chile, of course, our good buddy Sergio, Rise to the Sky, with Never Death Will Never Keep Us Apart. Or you can check out his latest album, which is
The
still
latest one's
phenomenal.
really good too.
But to me, Death Will Not Keep Us Apart probably his most ambitious work to me, in my opinion. We of course now we're going to the Ukraine, our fellow brothers in the Ukraine. We have Audrey Groom with Painted Mind, their 2020 album release. Psychological rock, death doom, kind of the way I can describe it is Pink Floyd, but on acid. That's like the best way I can describe it. From the UK, Clouds with Durrey, one of the most somber death doom albums you're gonna listen to in your lifetime. We have also our latest release with Consecration with Cynics. If you like the more disembowelment, My Dying Bright, then you're gonna love them. From the Netherlands, we have Septimo Desigrim with the Spooky Gloom, and now released in 1989. So probably one of the most earliest albums in Death Doom's history. We also Eastern of Winds, Find the Way Together, released in 1995. Another more underground kind of Death Doom band out there. We also have Celestial Season with Mystem 1, their latest album in 2022. Kind of an anthology they're going to release in the later couple of months, a part 2 and part 3. From Sweden, we have Doom VS with Earthless with the 2014 album. We have Slumber with the 2004 albums Fallout. From Germany, we have Kaliosus from Liquid Darkness. From the Faroe Islands, we have Hanford with Chamsis Leckerman, which I ordered that album. It's some of the most evil, but at the same time somber Death Doom albums you're going to listen to in the past couple of years. From Japan, we have Anatomia with Corporal Torment 2021 album release. From France, we have Winter with Over Dark, their 2022 album release. And last but not least, we have from the Czech Republic, It Morir with Epigrammatica 2022 album release.
And let's not forget another Ukraine band. I just said 1914. That album, Black and Death Doom, it's almost like Blackened Bolt Thrower a little bit.
In a way. So
from and then also from Japan, Coffins.
Yes.
Basically Japanese autopsy.
Yes. So from the bands that we mentioned and the bands we mentioned in the top 10, the region that has the most Death Doom, of course, is a Europe dominated thing, for
Yes.
sure. In terms of countries,
I would say
Finland,
I will go ahead and say
Netherlands,
the best country for Death Doom, hands down, Finland. Because you
Finland
just
for
got
sure,
so
yeah.
many. The big two
Finland,
of Swallow the Sun and Hooded Menace.
yeah.
But even in the
Next to
90s, you had Ripicoliu and Unholy, and then like
hmm
Solithus and Swallowed,
yeah.
among so many others.
Yeah, so to me, the pioneer of Death Doom, Finland is probably the country to go for Death Doom, but also the Netherlands, another great country. Even the UK has some great Death Doom
And even
in
the
the
States.
States.
The
In the
States,
States, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so those are probably the four main countries: Netherlands, Finland, the States, and the
And the
UK for
UK.
Death Doom. Of course,
Yeah.
there's so many Death Doom that even me I have yet to discover. So don't ask me for it because I forgot this band. Trust me, I did my best research. If there's a band that I don't know, I'll discover it later. And if it's a band you want me to listen to, I'll definitely check it out. Again, it is my wheelhouse, so it's a never-ending thing. So probably I'll keep adding more Death Doom to it and finding more stuff in the future.
Right. Well,
hmm
ladies and gentlemen, that will wrap up this episode. Next episode will be episode 69. But as far as what we'll be talking about, that remains to be seen. We might
hmm
do an album episode about Emperor. We might do another top 10. We'll figure it out. Hopefully, in the next
hmm
2-3 weeks, we'll have an episode ready and locked and loaded. Or it could be an interview episode. We could.
Yeah.
I still need to get a hold of Jeremy from Broken Hope about when he would be available to do the long-awaited interview that's been about a year in the making. Or getting
Yeah.
James from Hellripper back to do the first wave proto black metal albums list.
hmm
So there is that. But anyways, that will do it for Ricky and I. That was our top 10 Death Doom albums. And until next time, horns high. We'll see you in the next one.